and footballs, brought to you by Prepare Like a Pro. My name is Jack McLean. I'm the host, and today I'm lucky enough to have Sophia Nymphis today as our guest. We'll be discussing everything that you need to know when it comes to ACL mitigation and prevention in elite football. If you have any questions, make sure to send them our way, as we'll hopefully find some time a little bit later on the show. But welcome, Soph. Really looking forward to our chat. Thanks for finding the time and jumping on.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Jack, and we'll see if I can give a different perspective. I don't know if I'll answer all your questions about ACL mitigation, but it's worth a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's complex, complex injury, that's for sure. So, and in the nature of, whether it be soccer, football, rugby, pretty chaotic sports. So no doubt we can't prevent them all, but strength and conditioning coaches, we can certainly try. But for those that aren't aware of your background, no doubt most will be, certainly strength and conditioning sports science. But do you mind providing, I guess, where it all started for you? So if your passion, where you found your passion for the industry, and different work experience that you've done along the way.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to have a prior career as an athlete. I went through the NCAA system in the United States, playing both basketball and softball at the time, and from that, I had a lot of contact with support personnel. Unknowingly, that was probably the profession that I was going to land in. But to be honest, while I was an athlete, I didn't realize that those people that were doing those roles, strength conditioning, physiotherapists, were destination roles for a career. At that time, I was still looking very medical, biology, sport management, and it was an athletic trainer, same as a physiotherapist, who tapped me on the shoulder and brought me to my first strength and conditioning conference and said, "I think you'll resonate with these people." And it really opened my eyes. And 25 years later, here I am. So that was the start of it. It did start as being an athlete, as many of us have, and I transitioned to becoming a strength conditioning coach in the NCAA system. So going from the player to coach transition, I think many of us do that. Made lots of mistakes on your first cohorts, like anybody, and then continued through that and found my way into research eventually, and have straddled the line between practitioner and researcher for the past 20 years. I have lived in Australia for 20 years. I had more of an explicit focus on being a coach when I was in the US. When I transitioned to Australia, that was like my catapult into the research area, but you never forget where you come from. So that's why there's always a feather in the hat of all of our research questions come from that S&C kind of focus or lens, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great blend of I guess the big three, both scientist, coach, and athlete. You mentioned an athlete trainer sort of roped you into a conference. What sort of qualities? What do they recognise in you? Do you think that why you would love the field?
I wish I knew exactly, and I should probably ask them explicitly. I still have a relationship with them. So their name's Jennifer O'Donoghue. She's currently leading or a lead in sports medicine at NC State, so North Carolina State University, a really, really big program. Many of you, the Wolfpack. I think she just recognized a genuine interest. Maybe I asked a lot of questions while I was sitting on that bloody table having a ankle wrapped or a blood blister popped or something, and she went, "You know what, you've got all these questions, maybe you should go find the answer." So I don't know exactly what she saw in me. I don't know, that's a talent ID question, but she took the time to help guide someone who was not necessarily lost, but had no idea that this was the direction that I was pointing. So grateful to those people that take that time. Like many of us have coaches take us under the wing at some point. Super influential people.
Yeah, definitely. And so good segue for the next question. Mentors or influences that have helped shape your philosophy along your, like you said, 25-year sort of journey. What are the ones that sort of pop up front of mind? Your biggest influences to date?
Yeah, I guess I started with Jen because many people wouldn't know her. She is also a CSCS for those in the United States. That's the certification in the US, of course, for certified strength conditioning specialists. But she tapped on the shoulder someone whose name many people might know is Travis Triplett or Travis Triplett McBride. You might have seen the research. And that led me to meeting Jeff McBride. So these are influences from the research world. Alongside, as a practitioner, I met Mike McGuigan actually in the United States which many of us know. Now he's in New Zealand, was in Australia. But he was in Wisconsin when I met him, a Kiwi somewhere in the middle of Wisconsin. And, he's always worn both hats, really great strength coach, but also a really great researcher. So just these serendipitous touch points, I think when I met them, don't let them know this, I didn't realize the status they held in the field. And as I transitioned and I went through and I did my PhD with Mike when he came to Australia, and Rob Newton. These are all people that many of us have read their work, or they set a big foundation for that merging of sports science and strength and conditioning practice early. And I'd say I was pretty lucky to come across all of those range of practitioners, many others besides all those named, but those are the ones that I happened to do my research profile with. And I had a lot of other coaches that I'd have to go through that were great strength coaches. And again, some of them well ahead of their time, doing jump profiling in the late 90s, probably on the first bespoke pieces of equipment that were built at the time for the Chicago Bulls, an extended kind of Smith machine to tolerate their heights, to enable us to measure with a linear position transducer. And we actually bought that and had at University of Wisconsin La Crosse. Again, I had no idea what seemed like a normal environment to me. Oh, this is what happens when you move to the next level. That in 25 years time would be something that we're still sussing out as far as profiling.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What an experience, and it's another good segue for moments of your career that you're sort of most proud of, highlights if you like, that you look back on fondly.
Yeah, I hope I'm not done, but I guess some career highlights are always those transition points. Obviously the transition point from athlete to coach, that was a really, really big thing. It was one of those moments where I realized it was okay to let someone back you 100% before you back yourself. And that was that transition when Jen literally called Travis on the phone and said, you should take this kid. They've got some talent. And I had a coaching history as a basketball coach. I coached, and as a softball coach, I coached, but not maybe as a strength conditioning coach. But I had great interest in the profession because it helped me stay as an athlete who was undersized, right? If you're undersized, you better be stronger and faster than everybody, because that's the best you can do, and as skilled as possible. And I knew that elongated my career. So that was a great touch point, that transition point. And then moving to Australia, like I had watched the Sydney Olympics like everybody else. Being an American in a very big country, we should do well, but watching Australia do better than they should relative to population made an impact. And I watched the sports science grow, and we weren't in a position at the time in the US for it to be such a big profession. And I wanted to chase that. So it was a big moment for me. I left everything I knew, and everyone I knew, to chase a dream in Australia, and I'm still here. So those are probably the two biggest touch points, and I'm proud of the people that took a chance on me, and I'm proud of myself for taking a chance on myself, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting insight into that time where you saw some opportunity in Australia. How did you go about that? I guess for listeners thinking about trying to, whether it be first foot in the door in pro sport, or trying to get into research and trying to get into something new and uncomfortable. What was your strategy there? Was it reaching out to your networks? Was it cold emails? Talk us through sort of your mindset there to create that reality.
That opportunity was created by my then mentor, Jeff McBride, reaching out to Rob Newton. Again, it's people backing you, literally putting their reputation on the line for you. So I'm lucky in that, and people do that. And when they do, you take it. I will say I didn't think as much as you normally should about moving to the literal opposite side of the world, and that was probably a good thing, because if you consider it too much, you might talk yourself out of it. So I remember kind of really having the magnitude of the move hit me when I landed in Singapore. A little bit too late to start thinking about that. But when I looked on the map and I recognized very little about where I was and where I was going, I realized, oh, wow, yeah, this is far away, and I'm not quite sure if this is going to work, but here I am, and I'll make the best of it. So sometimes thinking less is probably my advice,
Yeah,
and jumping
yeah,
in. Yeah, but
yeah. I love that.
it's hard. I had support, and that I had a family that supported, but I maybe was taking a huge risk financially. I think I landed in Australia. Don't tell the government this because they probably would have sent me back with their current policies, but I only had about $2,000 to my name. And you know that won't support you very long in Australia. So, yeah, a lot of risk, but luckily in this case, a lot of reward. But I was lucky with some supports around me just in case it didn't work, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And most significant challenges you face over your career, I guess moments where you learnt or grew the most as a coach and a scientist.
I don't think a day goes by that I'm not learning or not doubting, but then rebacking myself. I go through that circle of life every day. I wish it got better the further you went in your career, but like many people say, the further you go along, the more you realize you don't know, which gives you another crisis of confidence. Um, but I'd say probably biggest challenges for me are really negotiating when you provide services and delivery of information to groups and people and organizations that aren't funded to be able to be getting that level of support from you, maybe. So you're weighing up your values of knowing this is important to do, and it's not that they're not paying you because they can't, but they're not in a position to, versus valuing your time to a degree. And that's a regular conversation I have for myself of when you donate time and when you value your time and how you walk a very fine line of that. It's a huge challenge to me, actually.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt that would resonate with I think a lot of the coaches, no matter where you are in your journey. What's your process with that to, I guess, have clarity in making the? Is it a gut feeling thing? Is it? Yeah, how do you sort of go about making the decision?
To a degree, there's non-negotiables on that I might put on the line. That might be associated with some external factors I'm feeling. Like if I have a lot going on, then I have to be quite a lot more strict. Um, and then I do value the impact this might make for a group, an organization, a team. Um, and sometimes those are the things that you think, will this make such a trajectory change at the time that you'll be talking about this when someone says, what do you look fondly upon in your career?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I don't always make that call correctly. I have, oh, I should have been a little more strict on that moments all the time. And then I have moments when I go, I wonder if I should have, but nonetheless, good thing is lots
Yeah,
of opportunities do come along. Lucky enough, it's never just a once in a lifetime.
yeah, yeah. Oh, we'll dive straight into the topic. I guess ACL injuries in field-based team sports doesn't have to be AFL specific, but in what you've seen in your work, what are some of the most common causes of an ACL injury?
Yeah, so we still see a substantial proportion of them happening in non-contact scenarios, and the proportion of that varies predominantly by the split of men's and women's competitions, but nonetheless, they still exist in both cohorts. And independent of the rules of the game, there's something about the situation having an extended knee placing you in a risky scenario. And the situations in which that occurs is often sidestepping, decelerating, or landing from jumps. That has been a pretty steady description of how most ACLs occur across multiple sports, whether that's a rectangular field or a round field, whether it's a 360-degree game or not. I think the situations leading to it may start varying by sports. So, for instance, the idea of a duel, that in the football soccer context, there's more evidence showing that may be a really characteristic environmental constraint that puts you in those extended knee postures. You're making more sudden decisions, and that might be defensively. It's not necessarily always offensively, but particularly defensively in a dual scenario. There's been readjustments in how we're seeing not just what you're doing, but the context. So in that case, looking at dueling situations seem to be this new bit of information that we're deriving. We haven't necessarily placed that context in AFL, but I'm sure it wouldn't be too far. It just might have a slightly altered context because of that 360 aspect that we deem maybe is why we see those slightly higher incidence rates in AFL versus other, say, rectangular based or forward facing. You face your opponent most of the time, kind of rule based sports.
Yeah, yeah. And so the duelings, that would be for the contested nature of the ACL injuries, or they even set up for non-contact?
For not non-contact, so it's contested but not contact necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about fatigue? What's your sort of stance on that? Like, do more ACL injuries happen, yeah, with high sort of metabolic fatigue, or later in a game, or is it just something that perhaps isn't as big of a factor as we think?
Yeah, this is a cool area, and I wish I had more answers, but I think asking the questions differently probably is where we have to go because we're in a circular cycle with fatigue. One study finds that under fatigue conditions, people put themselves in more at-risk postures, and therefore we claim maybe more at risk under fatigue. Then the other scenario is people are evaluating quote unquote when ACL injuries are happening, and in some research, it's indicated that they happen during times of the game when someone wouldn't necessarily be perceived as being underneath fatigue. So which is it? And
Yeah,
this kind of comes to the scenario of what people do under fatigue and whether the risky posture ultimately leads to an ACL injury or whether the quote unquote risky postures are just reiterating ACL straining events, but not necessarily tipping over into an ACL rupture event. And Dan Cadlick is doing a little bit of this research. And there's discussion about what people do under fatigue, and another colleague, Jake Cowan, also has done his PhD in this area, so to speak, about what we do. So not necessarily in the context of ACL, but how do we choose to move when we're under fatigue? And interestingly enough, when we look at the concept of one's movement variability, so you want a healthy amount of variability in how you move. It helps you distribute load to different tissues, right? If you move the exact same way over time, then you're obviously putting yourself at risk at an overuse type of injury or just repeatedly straining the same tissues. But if you slightly alter the way in which you move, then you can kind of spread out that tissue load. So individuals that under fatigue still maintain that variability of movement, they probably are fine, unless they choose to move broad in their variability of movement, where they move in a way that they don't traditionally practice. And if they don't traditionally practice, they may be exposing tissues at lengths of tissue ranges of motion that they haven't conditioned. So does that put you more at risk? The other
yeah,
alternative is, and we probably could anecdotally see it, is the people that under fatigue that lock up. They restrict the ways in which they move. And that, again, could put someone repeatedly straining the same tissues. So I think the disparity may have some solution or some discovery in what's the nature by which people utilize or fail to utilize movement variability as a tool when under fatigue, and does that increase or decrease overall risk? And that could be risk in the scenario or the risk of repeatedly straining the same tissue, which I think we'll get into about maybe changing the way we look at ACL injuries. We do look at it like it's a one-off thing that you just put yourself in a funny situation this one time that you've apparently never been in, and then that's what causes it to break. But if we watch highlight reels, some of the best highlight reels look conspicuously like the same exact movement patterns, extended limb positions, sidestepping mechanics that elicit a fantastic maneuver to evade or a fantastic maneuver to tackle, as they are subsequently end in the catastrophic ACL injury. So there's room to ask, why are the thousands of times you do that same thing not ACL rupturing? Why is it the 10,001 time happens to be the time in which you rupture the ACL? And are those events really so categorically different that one just exceeds ACL tolerance? So as far as the tensile strain that's required to rupture it, and all those others, did it really just fall just below the threshold of rupture?
yeah,
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll get into that. But there's a wrapping of these concepts of, is fatigue just yes or no, or is it relative to how you manage your fatigue and what that does for increasing or decreasing the risk? And these are the questions we're probably doing a better job of asking now, but not necessarily have the final answers of.
Yeah. And I guess fatigue, I was probably a bit broad there, but like you could look into cognitive fatigue going into the match, physical fatigue, we mentioned metabolic fatigue, but there's like lots of layers in what is fatigue for an athlete. Um, the, the mechanisms you mentioned, what are some of your, with our coach's hat on, what are some of your sort of non-negotiables with that in mind when you're going to a new squad, I guess, and you're putting a program in place and you think, and they have had ACL issues with their program, so it's something that the coaching team, the board, the directors, everyone's on angst about it, plus the players, and you're brought in as an expert, I guess. What would be some of the things you'd like to really see from a strength and conditioning point of view in that program?
This will probably not be a popular thing, but something that I've heard anecdotally from multiple people. So the way we report ACL, the ACL injury, the incidence rate, and so if you normalize it, like for women in football at the elite level, it's just slightly lower, but on average, 1 ACL per team per season. Like if you normalize it to thousands of hours of training, it sits around that. At the elite level, it varies in different contexts, but it doesn't happen like that. Like we say that and we're like, okay, we had our ACL this season, so we're good, and then next season it'll be somebody else. It doesn't happen in this regular, like just methodical format. Many people that are on the ground collecting this data always make this side comment around the clustering of these events. So it'd be like, it's not 1 in a season, it's like 3 or 4, and then you won't have 1 for 3 or 4 seasons. And the curious thing about this is I've heard this from practitioner in the men's and women's games. So it's this clustering. But then we average it out when we're reporting and we pretend like it's just this methodical thing that's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So,
It's definitely
so
something I've noticed.
that
The
lends us to
clustering.
go, okay, this clustering and then it goes away. The problem with that is what happens is the people that were susceptible seem to have fallen susceptible. And then they kind of get pushed aside because now they have to rehabilitate. So they're out of the team. And then we come in and we savior it. We come in and we do something and we think we fixed it because nothing happens for a couple of years. And that's quite common. But it could be that you just removed those that were the most susceptible. And no matter what you did, you were likely not going to see many more because you rid the cluster. And the cluster probably were people that had multiple factors that leave them more susceptible occur simultaneously. And this goes to that nature of, for a long time, the early research wanted to pin it on a factor. And we would dance around. A factor was it was a valgus knee position. And then we're like, oh, maybe that happens after you tear your ACL and then you have no restraint between the tibia and femur and your knee goes into valgus, but you snapped it time-wise before that. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's, and then we would just jump from thing. Maybe it was the activation of quad to hamstring. Maybe that's the thing, that's the missing thing. Maybe it's the shape of the tibial plateau. Maybe it's that thing. Now, as I went through those, it was quite intentional, is that some factors are innate. You can't, well, I'm going to put an asterisk, you can't change it quickly. So like people's tibial plateau, it's a bone. It's bloody, one of the slower tissues to adapt. But we know bone morphologically can adapt. We're just a little angst that it'll take years for that to occur, and a lot of the bone morphology is more responsive to the things that you do through and after puberty in those key years. So when you come in, you have to consider there'll be a couple people here that are susceptible through the things that are either very slow to adapt or you could never change it. Family history of ACL injury. And that probably lends to maybe skeletal morphology, joint laxity, hypermobility, other factors that predispose you like FAI. If you have that, and maybe there was a change in scheduling, maybe a change in structures of practice because there's new coaches, new staff. If you start to get these multiple factors come in, The people with the predisposing factors, plus other factors that maybe on their own wouldn't matter, but in combination with pre-existing factors, you get that puff. You get the that little, like, it's just it's like a gremlin, and it runs through it, and it only eats the ones that have the predisposing. Not everybody becomes susceptible. So I think that's why it's so hard to understand what really makes a difference, because we always care after catastrophe strikes. And the likelihood is we've already rid the most predisposed people, so anything you do will. But you mentioned about non-negotiables coming in. Well, the first non-negotiable is evaluating the history of the people that I have here and understanding some of their likely not quickly changing risk factors, and then the likely never to change risk factors. And I don't know how much we kind of flag and place them into those categories. And the only reason you would do that is to be overabundant about addressing things that may reduce their risk. So if you have someone that has FAI, restricted internal hip range of motion, which is what that actually manifests in, and that's kind of what we believe puts that increased risk for ACL tear, and you also have that family history, then you would be even more robust in developing the co-contraction or the muscular support around that knee. You would be even more robust in trying to maximize the hip range of motion they do have. You would be even more robust about ensuring that they have the ability to manage restrictions on their trunk control or perturbations. And you would be even more hesitant about ensuring that they have a consistent development and transition from high magnitude areas or risk areas, which all of us have, and we play the game with risk in preseason of the fine line between getting a couple of hamstrings and doing enough high speed work to prevent hamstring, right? The same as here is really playing the dance between risk and reward, but being more so adequate about building the factors that can help protect when we identify someone as having those predisposed risk factors. That's my non-negotiable, is that conversation between, it's not that they're bad player. It's just that we pay more attention to these things, where if we don't pay attention to that with these other players that don't have that, we can almost do a lot to them and not see what should be the outcome if it was just so straightforward that these things cause an ACL.
Yeah, yeah. And is that like more or less the whole squad might be doing that type of work, but there's just a little bit more attention to detail with how those risk players, I guess, doing the exercises and the quality they're doing it, or are they doing more of a specific program?
It's I will go to that awareness of how they do what they do. So in the exercises, right, there's getting it done, and that's getting it done well. And I would say that where scenarios, this is actually circling back to the movement variability piece, is that if you notice that an individual in performing jumps, single-legged, dual-legged, repeated kind of hops, have a particular strategy, it's not that you want to take that strategy away, but it's about checking that they have other strategies as well. And so that's in the design and being a coach of, that's great, you did that. What if I then introduce this new constraint? This is the research that Dan Cadlick's been looking at, is what do you do when I introduce a constraint? And as much as I wish that the outcome of that research was this constraint does this to a person, this constraint does that to a person, what we find is particular constraints for many people can, for instance, if we add a constraint to the trunk, like by adding a little bit of mass, taking away the arms to counterbalance, for instance, it traditionally adds load to the knee. And by load, I mean either the power at the knee, so relative knee joint power or knee joint moment. And that happens for most of the athletes, but there's always some that derive a strategy where that doesn't occur. And so what we've realized is that that's the importance of having a breadth of constraints, because the one thing I can guarantee you is your whole team will not do it the same way. They won't solve that problem the same way. But if you have a breadth of strategies, your likelihood of forcing individuals into developing a suite of movements, and this goes back to that question around, is it what you prescribe them or is it how they do it? I'd say how they do it, and us being smarter about having a little more control without being explicit, without telling them what to do. Is getting them to solve it, but knowing that the constraints are going to change the possible ways they could solve it.
Interesting. It's trying to get a better understanding of, I guess, what you're looking for when you're trying to increase the player's movement variability. So if you've changed the drill, but their strategy is the same, whether it be a forward hop, and then now they've got a forward hop without using their arms, their hands are on their hips. If their lower limb's doing the same thing, is that not got the desired outcome? You actually want to see a variation in the variability without obviously giving them feedback. Am I on the right path there? Or?
It'd be a great outcome that they could succeed despite. So that would be like a succeed despite having no counter movement with the arms for balance, that they can still perform it in a relatively similar way. That's the performance outcome. But what you're also trying to do is, did they choose to go to doing more work at the hip, or did they do more at the knee, or did they do more work at the ankle? And ultimately, if no matter what you did to them, they always did most of their work at the knee, what you learn is that, okay, that's fine. In these activities, say these plyometrics, what I know is that they'll do a lot of work at the knee. So that's fantastic for the development of quadricep, hamstring, and in a very important movement skill with the speed of movement and the relevance of that movement. But if I program that a lot, I need to keep in the back of my mind that I might have to do some isolation work or specific work to ensure hip development, because they're not going to attain it through these drills. So sometimes you can try to shove this person through constraints to getting more balance or becoming more, doing more work at the hip, but they're just avoidant. And so in that scenario, I guess that's where I still think there's room for particular targeted isolation, because the best you can do is at least know that if you indeed do call upon that tissue, although you don't seem to want to do it in any of the drills I'm putting forward, that at least that tissue has been developed. And that probably goes to that idea of someone broadens their movement solutions under fatigue to something they never touch normally. The first
they're vulnerable.
Is that tissue's never been conditioned.
Where
yeah,
that's where the isolation comes in. You've prepared for that moment potentially.
The ideal is the whole suite. You've prepared it through isolation. You do it in the context of relatively prescribed movement, and then they call upon it when you set the constraints or in free constrained conditions. That's the goal circle, right? But it never works that well. Never does. So as an S&C, first and foremost, I've conditioned your tissues to tolerate it if you finally call on it.
And have you? It's fascinating. With working with the youth, do you feel like that's achievable? Like you've got a bit more of a clean canvas, or is it just that's just the way that we move due to our family history and the way that we've always done things, no matter what the age? Or have you found that you actually can sort of get to that point, the ideal where they'll rely more often than not on a different strategy depending on the task?
Yeah, like anything, the earlier we can broaden, it's fundamental movement. And it's like make fundamental movement great again, like running, jumping, throwing, catching, tracking, moving objects. All those fundamental movement skills, the more they can broaden that, the more they can call upon them in situations maybe uncommon to call upon them. And that's that idea. And there's much better people to talk about this around talent transfer than I, but I work with really good people, so I can copy the things I hear them say. And there are people that can go through a pathway of movement and say they started in footy and they always stay in footy and they end in footy and they have lots of ways to move in a footy context. But there's also people and benefits that we see from people that could equally play basketball as they could play soccer, as they could play footy, and and how they brought in even the creativity of movement because of the ways in which those sports shove you to movement. There's so many things we develop or should develop that the sport itself doesn't develop, and what that brings to the sport in creativity and in this instance, maybe resistance to injury. And I'd say that earlier, particularly for our girls, and I say earlier in chronological age, because we've still yet to find a way to reckon with the fact that girls go through puberty and are more mature at a younger age, but yet we kind of start them in resistance training, start them in S&C at relatively similar, if not older ages than the boys. And so they've had a longer period of time to ingrain maybe not the breadth and suite of quality movement that we want. And that's not making them robots. It still can be creative and broadened, but we're not challenging them young enough.
Yeah. With the, well, I guess, but when you're going through this process with a new squad, is it tests or do you use training as sort of your way to identify their tendencies, whether it be fresh, be fatigue? What's some of your favorite ways to when you're learning an athlete and how they move?
I've gone the whole circle on this. So I used to be really regimented, and I think there's still a lot of merit in, particularly for youth cohorts, is kind of having your fundamental movement. I guess some people will call it like a FMS or a fundamental movement screen. The ones that we use and some that I've developed, or actually leveraged off of those that have developed these for lots of sports, like Jeremy Shepard. He did it with volleyball, and then he turned around and did it with surfing. And curiously, I've borrowed that a lot and stolen those concepts for softball, because there's two joints that are really, really critical for surfing. And you think that these sports have nothing in common, but if you don't have your shoulders and hips in check with softball, it's a really challenging thing, because that's where all rotation occurs through, and that's where all throwing comes from. Curiously, if you want to paddle and you want to be able to get in deep, powerful turns when you're surfing, you need hips and shoulders. So, but those basic fundamental movements, so those are starting with some things that are very common for S&C. So working your way up to every athlete should be able to overhead squat with 50% of their body weight, right? Before they're kind of moving into heavier loading of back squat and front squat. Whether you keep to strict, like it has to be met before you move into those loadings. I don't know if it has to be strict, but there's a lot of things that you get away with, as we know, with back squats and front squats that may not be advantageous for good transfer, but they get you stronger on paper. And so paying attention to what he valued in that movement quality, it taught me a lot, and I still hold on to that. And then the problem with that is, with the sports that I work with, is I don't always have that much time. We had a suite of about 11 exercises, I think, and monitoring them now. So what I've gone full circle to is, at the end of the day, with the experience I have in watching movement, and that's a privilege, I can see a lot in watching those athletes play the sport. And then after I get a hunch on key factors, and you can hear me, their ranges of motion, the strength at length at the shoulder through the hip, control of the trunk, ability to get in and out of deep flexion positions. All of these things are actually ubiquitous in most sports. If I see that not happening, my next job is, in the context of the sport, is to try to set a drill or a constraint where I have to force them to do it. So athletes get away with a lot, and that doesn't mean they're incapable. And so my next part, so I typically start this movement screening by watching a lot of them play inherently. And then the next part is to design some drills to put them through to see if they were just avoiding it because they're better at something else, or if they're actually incapable of doing something. And from there, I design kind of the program to alleviate that.
Yeah, interesting. And that's when you're watching it, do you have to slow it right down, like watch the video in slow motion, or is that, talk us through your process in?
It doesn't have to be super. So we just film it at usual 60 frame per second, whatever your video camera is. And really quickly you start to see compensations that athletes have. I'll give exact examples in the sport I'm fortunately staring at right now, working with junior national softballers, is so they have to field a ball off the ground. And in footy, this is ground ball. So, like, listen, a lot more
same.
than you think. There's players that will flex heaps at the hip that leaves them susceptible in footy to get a big knock, right? Because it changes your line of sight. It puts you in a compromised position if you do get contact. For us, what it does is it changes the line of sight of your head. So you go from very high to very low, and then you have to pick your head back up and throw. And the more you move your head around, the more you lose accuracy, right? Because moving your head around is not ideal for balance, proprioception, and then ultimately throwing a ball for us to the other side of the field on target. Players that are strong have the mobility and choose to get low through flexion at the knee, stay low, maintain the low position, and throw from the low position. If we switch this from softball, fielding a ground ball and throwing that, to footy and getting a ground ball, if contact is imminent, they can scan, they can see, and they can protect. But if you're flexed at the hip instead of squatted down at the hip and knee, you're at risk of not only injury, but a failure of performance, of getting out of that situation. So as much as the sports vary, there's so much commonality in just movement demands. And this is why I think we should watch the sport and understand the sport. And that's the context I like to initially watch movement. But as far as what I do in the weight room and as an S&C, you dial it back down to the basics. And so that might be just doing simple drills of holding a medicine ball and doing a low walk for quite a few more meters than they like to do. It doesn't have to be
duck walks.
Yeah.
Yeah. A quad burn.
Everyone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. I guess that process of, like, if when you're going through that, and then there's like you said, have they got the capacity to do it, or is it more just something you're going to train? So for the ones that do have the capacity, but they've just, for whatever reason, they've just developed that habit where they do, it's inefficient sort of pattern. How do you sort of retrain that? What sort of, is that something you do in the gym and you sort of, and then you try and then transfer it onto the field, or talk us through that process where they do have the mobility and the strength to be able to perform the task, but they've just developed a different pattern for whatever reason, where they are flexing the hip and the spine more than you'd like with the knee and the ankle maybe and hips.
Yeah, I don't know if this is right, and it's also an answer of how long's a piece of string. But so the first one is deciding how much of an impact it's going to make. So why are you going to make a change? So they are capable, so they could do it, which means though they may select it given absolute desire or need. But is the way in which they're doing it putting them in substantial enough risk from an injury point of view that we can have a cohesive multidisciplinary team talk about, I don't know how I feel about this? Or is it a nice to have? Like, I don't like the way that looks. And we all have things that bring poison to our eyeballs. And I have a couple of them that might come out in pet peeves later on. But that's not necessarily a good enough reason to change something, because it's a huge investment in time. And so you are now going to weigh up several factors: the psychology of the athlete and their ability to buy into change, that it's part of a long-term plan, and that it's going to make a significant impact on either reduction of risk we've deemed as imminent or an increase in performance. So if they can, but they don't, and you don't have a legitimate reason for those two, I probably won't change it. But this is where I think, I have no other research outcomes to give you other than this is the coaching hat of a discussion between the skills coach being like, this will fundamentally limit them. While they will get to a very high level, they will never be great like this. Versus, I've seen weirder things.
Yeah. Pick your battles.
Yeah, and I don't know how to make that conclusion, but I know that it forms a majority of the discussions that I have with my skills coaches about, should we change this, or do we have bigger fish to fry? Should I get a bigger problem?
Yeah, definitely. No, well said. What about going back to ACL? What are some of the things that when you see when you're going through this process, if you're watching them and you know they've got FA, they've got family history, they're at risk, and then you're seeing some things and you're like, well, this is some alarm bells going. I need to act on this.
Yeah, this is the biggest change in my view because I came up in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, where basically if you had an outstretched knee and you were particularly sidestepping or decelerating, you were gonna die. And I've been looking at this a little bit differently from a couple of researchers that have brought it up, but maybe we're just not getting on their bandwagon of going, that's a pretty legitimate thing for us to consider. So this is where I'm probably going with this is I'll bring up baseball slash softball, but mostly baseball as an example, is the UCL, ulnar collateral ligament. For a long time, we deem that injury, although catastrophic when it happens, a function of an overuse injury. Like you've tempted fate too many times, throwing with a torque at the elbow that eventually continually tears the UCL until it lowers the tensile strength by which it would fail. And then you do the same pitch that you've done a billion times, but because the damage is there, you now tear the UCL with a throw that typically, before it was damaged repeatedly without repair, it wouldn't have broken. That's it's accepted. It's led to some changes, pitching and perspective. We're not quite there yet, but we're thinking better about that injury. For some reason, we don't think about the ACL like that, but the ACL is still a ligament. It's a ligament that has a tensile failure point, and it can be damaged at a rate that's higher than its repair. And if that does occur, then you can place yourself at risk of doing something you've done a million times. And this time, though, it exceeds your failure rate, not because the movement itself was categorically different to things you've done before, but because the ligament has been damaged to reduce below a level of the loads that you commonly place on it. This is a fatigue failure hypothesis. And fatigue failure hypothesis is fundamental to tissue, period, done. Doesn't matter what tissue it is. It could be bone, it could be ligament, it could be. I think we need to revisit why we don't consider this as a legitimate reason for ACL injury, for the reasons that are kind of self-evident. Because if it can be a function of this mismatch between damage and repair, then as a strength conditioning professional, there's two things we can do. One is to start paying attention to movements or activities in our trainings that are ACL straining. And we know what they are because they are actually those fundamental things that we say, non-contact injuries, X, Y, and Z. These are likely ACL straining. And at particular phases of our season, like preseason, when we start to increase those things, that we're like, oof, maybe it's breaking down a little bit here. But also realizing that the ligament has a repair and it is adaptable. And that's something that the research and more needs to be done in space to demonstrate this causal link. But resistance training through big ranges of motion, like deep knee flexion, anytime basically quad does lots of work, quad also strains ACL, but in a way that the ACL can slowly adapt. And so that's why when we look at Olympic weightlifters, it is not surprising to see that their ACL thicknesses are more than 40% larger than age, mass, sex-matched controls. So that means that we need to have like a longer term view on building the strength of that ligament, just like we build, but realize that the time frame of that adaptation is going to be slower than muscle. So being careful about hanging all our hat on, I got them stronger, but recognizing that strength is a function mostly of muscular output and that there's a lag effect of our harder tissues, those that are mostly collagenous, like ligament. And that if we focus too much on strength, which was supposed to be a construct of like long-term training age to justify our existence, that we actually are potentially putting a mismatch between the strength of everything and the strength that's mostly measured, which is the output of the muscle. And so I go long-term training age and what's the buildup of that? And that's where it becomes pivotal for girls and why I mentioned before, hey, let's think earlier, not later.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that alongside, it's and, not or, alongside of that, that actually there is this risk reward and understanding that we do have to find out what's the time frame on this damage repair of the ACL. I think we do a better job in other soft tissue injuries, and we pay heaps of attention to it when recovering from injury, but kind of taking that mentality and bringing it on the prevention of injury, and realizing for ACL prevention, like I'm not discounting the success that the literature has shown in relatively recreational athletes on, say, neuromuscular activities, warm-up activities, but that is a very small window of adaptation. And if those don't have all the principles of progressive development, variety, progressive overload, that it will only work for that time period by which they've been tested. You can't just continue doing that warm-up from here on and think that that actually elicits a stimulus large enough to, one, do what I'm saying, which is fundamentally grow the strength and size of the ACL, and two, to actually be overloading the entire system in order to prepare the athletes long term as the game demands go up. So we gotta move beyond that warm up, I think, and that's why I think strength conditioning professionals are key to that discussion, because that was meant as a short term implementation in the absence of strength and conditioning. Now we need to turn the discussion back to what strength and conditioning need to look like for the breadth of reducing these ACL injuries, which is probably why we're stuck. You've noticed ACL injuries has pretty much stagnated, even in the AFL, stagnated, and then and Australia has one of the highest ACL rates in the world. So we also start resistance training quite late.
Yeah. Yeah. With I guess putting a periodized plan in place across your week. So if you're doing those deep flexion quad based movements in the gym, does it matter where they sort of fit in? Like if you've got 4 field sessions in the week, um, do you want to put them? Do you want to put that sort of deep knee flexion based work at the end where they have their longest rest, or does the gym pretty safe place and it's more the straining, the accel decel stuff we need to be mindful of with the strain to the respective strain to ACL?
From the evidence that we have, I would say the greater consideration and risk is the ACL straining, because of the rate of the strain that occurs during sidestepping. That rate isn't present, and that is a factor in the damage that we see of the collagen, is the rate of that. And so that's why on-field events are more the straining events. Also, the literature, and this is correlational, not causal, but when they ask people to reflect on increases or what they did in the 6 months prior to their ACL, they highlighted ramps in ACL straining activities, and that didn't necessarily, that wasn't pointing to resistance training. That was pointing to game-based play, high intensity activities. So I would say that those are probably more damaging at a rate that's really difficult to repair. Whereas just like muscle tissue damage in the weight room, we're pretty careful in the magnitude of damage, right? We stop before failure. There's a lot of stop gaps that are advantageous to enable us to perform repeatedly that we're doing a really good job in our programming now, like the profession's moved on and understanding how to maximize. I think that also is quite protective, even if inadvertent and not intentional from the start. And that being just enough to continue adaptation, but not such a damaging that it risks your inability to repair from it.
Yeah.
Speculative. Like we really need some first grade evidence to evaluate that, but it'd be a safer bet than what we're doing now.
Yeah. And would there be any way or any technology that we could put in place to sort of monitor the strain of an ACL over preseason, season to put some things in place to manage their loads, or to help manage players and prevent the ACL injuries?
Everything that we use to assume, and that word's intentional, the magnitude of strain on the ACL is still a degree away from really measuring it. And so there's still like a breadth of guesswork in this. So first, we're just monitoring load at the total body, and that's load loosely is whatever's happening at the center of mass. And that isn't representative of what's actually occurring at each joint. In the future, hopefully, maybe we will probably get to the point where we can broadly predict what's occurring at least the knee and hip. And there's other people that are looking into this. Some of the work from Jacqueline Alderson's group at University of Western Australia, they've been in this space for a really long time. At some point we will get there, but we're not yet there. So unfortunately, the simple answer is no, the technology is not there yet. First grade evidence will be trying to find measures that parallel to the amount of damage or strain. There's still some work being done. There's people that agree that what's a T2 relaxation MRI is indicative of the amount of collagen damage. That work shows some promise, but it's not to the point where I'd be telling everybody to do it, but it's at the point where I think that's where the research may go.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, fascinating. We've unpacked plenty of information there. Sophie, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to discuss around this topic of ACL and putting in, I guess, sound programs and practices to help mitigate ACL injuries with athletes?
No, not really. I think my biggest take home was, don't discount the importance of long-term athlete development. We have this obsessive narrative about an 8-week, 12-week warm-up intervention. And I think as beneficial as they've been at the community level, misaligned, it can almost sound like that's all we need. And I think that explains that stagnation, because we haven't had a really targeted long-term approach to developing the whole of a system, as well as that approach that's a little more nuanced. And that's what a multidisciplinary team is about, is around just being like higher risk, higher risk, higher risk. Oh, doing this, and this reduces risk, and having that conversation open. And that's actually a premise that's not just rooted in ACL injury, right? Like there's lots of factors and injuries, and that's what makes our job really interesting, but scary and really difficult. But as we continue to sit together and talk about it as being multiple aspects, we'll have better communication and be more likely to make better decisions on that. So probably those two things: better decisions with the multidisciplinary, and make a long-term athlete development an important part of the narrative because it's required.
Yeah, 100%. And that was definitely a standout. It's quite empowering, I guess, for those working with youth, or if you're in a school environment, how important that role is for setting up, whether they're competing at the highest level or they just want to play community sport for the rest of their lives for a long time and enjoy it. The impact that fundamental movement patterns can make. So I think it's a great message. Moving on to the last three questions to wrap it up, like you alluded to a little bit earlier, so there's more of the personal side, pet peeves in your work life, things that sort of fire you up, anything that makes you angry. Sounds like there's a couple there.
Yeah, I always feel like one of my pet peeves is we don't respect the profession and the contribution that strength conditioning coaches can give to an injury discussion. And I think that's what I just wanted to bring back, that we're actually a really key, pivotal part of the discussion. And I think because it has an injury attached, we always have a medical slant, but prevention requires the fundamentals of program design that strength conditioning professionals, our entire existence is around that, and we could leverage so pet peeves is forgetting about the poor S&C down there.
Yeah, love that. Represent. Favorite way to spend a day off?
Probably a mix of some kind of activity that isn't team sport. So I love mountain biking, climbing, bouldering, and the ocean. So anything outside, probably.
Yep. Yeah. And it's quite a popular one amongst our industry, getting outdoors
Yeah.
to recharge the batteries. Obviously, we're sort of getting close to the middle of the year of this recording. What's on the horizon for you, Steph? What are you excited about for the rest of the year?
Yeah, the rest of the year is probably just continuing some messaging and some discussions on what do we need to rethink about ACL injuries. I've got a lot of great people all over that are really interested in engaging in this conversation, because if we already knew all the answers, then we would have moved the needle a bit more, both in men's and women's. And that's the thing too. I think we just get the opportunity to question the women's because it's more in our face. But
Hmm.
let's not forget that most reconstructions around the world are men. So
Mm.
ACL reconstructions, and there's things that hopefully we'll learn by shedding this light on it that we can revisit. And I think, a tissue is a tissue. So if this idea of the repair versus the damage profile is something of merit, that actually explains why we're having some difficulty with our men that maybe have, even with a training history, um, that we can maybe look to in the future.
If I didn't ask this, yeah, what's your stance on non-op? It seems to be quite topical, pops up every so often.
For some people, it might work, and it depends on the approach. From that, I've seen a lot on the a brace protocol for
Hmm.
the repair. A brace protocol for athletes. One of the things I worry about is that fixed position at a short
Mm.
length. And one of the most damaging things to us as a human is lack of movement and lack of loading. And so my greatest fear not is weighing up the repercussions of lack of movement and atrophy versus what we know is quite a recovery. And depending on the type of graft that you choose for the ACL, what you'll have to choose your battle. Um, and and is the grass really greener, so to speak? Um, so let's just work on the end I like, which is to not argue about that at all and just stop it from happening.
Yeah, yeah, true. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us your time. I know we've been here for over an hour now, so I really appreciate you jumping on and sharing with us, which is such an interesting topic. It probably requires everything and more of strength and conditioning coaches, like you mentioned, the whole team, the skills coaches, psychology, lifestyle factors, and even plenty more that we don't even know about yet. So yeah, it's fascinating. Thanks for jumping on and sharing. I've got 3 pages of notes, and no doubt that the listeners do too. So thank you again. For everyone that's tuned in halfway, make sure to tune at the start. This will live on our YouTube channel until we release it on our podcast in the next few weeks. And our next live chat is with Matt Whitaker, who's a sports science at Carlton Football Club, which will be 4 p.m. Australian Standard Time, the 13th of June. So I look forward to seeing you guys then. Thanks again, Soph.
No worries. Thanks.
Best places, where should people get in contact if they've got any follow-up questions?
Yeah, you can follow me both I'm mostly on Instagram now, so at DocSoph. And if you pop into my message there and or emailing me or accessing my website, which is docsoph.com, there is a contact me page on there.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll add all those links in the show notes.